I don't think that we've done a good job in terms of recognizing that it isn't just the opioids. There's a much deeper cultural, societal issue going on here.
Every day, 91 Americans die from an overdose of opioids.
A new CDC report has some staggering statistics about drug overdoses. 72,000 people died last year.
The epicenter is in Ohio, where officials say they are on track for 10,000 overdose deaths this year.
Those on the front lines fighting against this epidemic, cops, foster parents, social workers, and teachers are feeling overwhelmed. It strained their resources like never before. Drug abuse, a prominent issue in American society, and even declared a threat to the nation at one point in time.
I began the meeting by making this statement, which I think needs to be made to the nation. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
In 1971, President Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs. Drug overdose deaths reached nearly 3,000 a year, the highest in American history at the time.
There's been a 230% increase since the early 2000s. That's nearly 15,000 deaths per 100,000 people a year.
In a message to Congress requesting additional funds for drug control programs, Nixon said we need to rehabilitate the drug user in order to eliminate abuse. Nearly 50 years later, the death toll has reached more than 70,000 people a year. Places like the John W. Clem House in Athens, Ohio, have been approaching drug addiction from a rehabilitative perspective for nearly 4 decades. According to Executive Director Ron Luce, as a society, we've strayed from that approach. He says at the Clem Recovery House, they are invested in the whole man, not just his addiction.
We reduce it all to the idea of there's a drug addict, we need to fix them, or we need to arrest them, or whatever. That might stop that person, but that doesn't solve the underlying issues and problems. If we throw every obstacle in their path, say lock them up and get rid of them, they might as well be dead, which, you know, those things get said. Wow, what a loss. What a horrible statement about humanity, to just assume that because a person uses drugs or alcohol, they're worthless.
Ron Luce knows the men he works with are not worthless. He was an addict who turned his life around and is now doing the same for others. One of those others is Brian Yates.
I started out when I was like 14, 50, started drinking and smoking weed. And then as I got older, it progressed into more. The Clem House, I feel like it's gave me structure, you know. I'm just hanging around with the wrong people. And then this environment here is good because we're all accountable for each other.
Brian says the environment is important, especially in these situations, and equally important when it comes to children. Experts say kids growing up in households where drug use is present often fall into the same path.
My daughter's in sober living now up in Dayton. She's a heroin addict. She's got about 80 days in clean.
I can't tell you the number of men that I've had sit in my office and disclose to me that they were sexually abused as children, or grew up in a family where mom and dad were doing drugs, maybe watched their parents overdose, maybe watched their parents die, grew up in extreme poverty, had to deal with physical abusive situations.
And breaking the cycle of those common issues usually falls to social workers, who say sometimes it feels like an impossible task. Nancy Bauer is the clinical coordinator at Bassett House Recovery Center. The center helps teenagers struggling with substance abuse. Through her experience, she recognizes the role parents have in continuing that cycle.
The cycle sometimes starts with the parents introducing the kids to the drugs because the parents don't want to get in trouble. So if the kids are also using, then they can't rat out the parents. So, I mean, there's just different ways that the kids get involved in it.
Bauer and Luce are in agreement. Opioids are just a small part of a much larger problem.
Did they get bullied at school? Did they do this? Did they, what happened that they wanted to escape from reality?
Children experiencing trauma that's untreated will result in adult behaviors that are problematic for the rest of society. That's all there is to it.
Chelsea Schott has been a foster mom for 5 years, basically from the beginning of the current opioid crisis, and she cares for some of its youngest victims.
With our opiate baby, he had skin issues, very severe, so we had to constantly keep him on medicated lotions, medicated diaper rash creams, because if you would just use like a normal brand, he would just break out in bleeding blisters.
And then there's also the emotional trauma and developmental delays as kids are moved from home to home.
I guess a neighbor had called Children's Services and said, you know, this mother dropped these kids off and said they'd be back, and it's been like weeks.
Neglect left these children without a sense of home and lack of stability.
You know, he was 4 at 6 homes, been abandoned by his mother. You can just imagine the gamut of issues he had. He wasn't potty trained. He had some medical issues that he needed addressed that had been neglected. He was just really, you know, badly damaged.
There has been a tremendous strain placed on the foster care system as a direct result of the opioid crisis. Barbara Klein is a quality assurance supervisor at Children's Services. She's been working in child welfare for more than 20 years. Klein sees the strain the opioid crisis puts on the system. Children suffering severe neglect because their parents are more interested in their next fix.
Neglect is that they don't have the food for them that they need. With younger kids, we'll put them in rooms so that they think that they're safe, so they'll kind of lock them in a room. Like 3-4-year-olds can tell you, you know, about the process that mom or dad did to take the drug. Mommy was sick, so she put a needle in, or mommy had this on, or mommy took this, and then she was sleepy.
Not having proper love and affection at a young age has lasting developmental effects. Educators like Athens High School principal Chad Springer believe they can lend a helping hand at school, but it's when the kids are sent back home that worries them.
You watch a kid leave and they had a great day here, and they go home, and it's scary what they go home to. It's cyclic, because once it's there, you know, the kids are exposed to it. You know, the research shows that more than likely they become the abuser, or that cycle of addiction continues, or they experience abuse and they abuse drugs and alcohol to cope with it later on in life.
As drug abuse and addiction continue to claim more victims, our needs for rehabilitation must be addressed. But if they aren't,
we're going to suffer the effects of the opioid crisis for generations to come.
a lot of recovery programs are altering the way they treat addiction by including families and friends through the process and emphasizing the need for self-love.
Are there any new programs that you know of that will be introduced in the future?
Yes, I was speaking with Barbara Klein from Children's Services, and she was telling me how they're hoping to soon implement a program where they partner with Ohio State and bring therapy animals into these visits with parents and children, just to ease the tension and help the children dealing with any kind of trauma.
Great, thank you, Brooke.